This week, we've covered how to protect your SQL scripts from what's called an injection. An injection is when someone adds a value to a variable that didn't come from a form. Now, in this one tutorial right now, I'm going to cover parametric binding, something that both the PDO and the SQLi database libraries offer. There's going to be a slight difference in the way PDO does it. The book covers the SQLi version. I'll cover both this week in my videos with examples, but for PDO, this is what I would use for this week's homework. Right now I'm looking at full name CRUD, and if you remember, this was what fueled your contacts CRUD homework. So if I go to, let me just fix that real quick. My form action should be going to full name CRUD. Anyway, if I were to hit reset on this and just reload and type in Christian Secor, we should see it functioning, and we do. So that aside, let's go into the script and look at where our danger areas are for security, as it is security week, so to speak, in this class. Now, right now, we have the database handle, which equals the connection, and the prepared statement. Now, that's a good thing to do, but what PDO and SQLi offer is the ability to replace the variables that come out with basically a placeholder for them to be replaced later. So what's happening here is that we're separating the values of the what the user entered, whether it's full name or whether it's something else. Obviously, in our database right now, we just had one field for simplicity. But what we can do is we can bind a parameter, and the numeral 1 will be the first question mark, and then the next parameter of this function will be the value itself that we're going to be placing inside the question mark. And then the last part will be what type of data do we expect. So I'm going to go for a param underscore string. So what we've just done is we've binded our first parameter, or bound our first parameter. We know that up full name will equal what the user entered. But what we're doing is binding this to this question mark for execution later. So I have another question mark right here, and I'm going to go ahead and bind a param 2 for that. And in this case, bind param will do 1 or 2 because it's the second question mark. We're going to do the update ID, and then the value this time is going to be numeric. So I'll do PDO : param underscore int, and that'll be an integer. And now when I go ahead and try this again, let's say I edit my name back to Chris Secor, we can go ahead and hit that, and it still functions. So what happened there? Well, let's take a good look at the bind parameter section in php.net real quick, and I'll go over it with you. So part of the safety with PHP data objects is the removal of variables from directly in the query. Now, it's still reasonably safe, but to be vulnerable, we're talking about levels of vulnerability here. What bind param will do is set the execution of a variable. I'm going to go to the very top here. And this is what's important. This is the very top of the page. Binds a PHP variable to a corresponding named or question mark placeholder in the SQL statement that was used to prepare the statement. Okay, so basically it's waiting for the execution before it runs. Now there's another type of binding called bind value. In this case, the variable is bound as a reference and will only be evaluated at runtime when the execute statement is called. So basically, let's go back here, and with bind value, the evaluation of the bound variables will only occur at execution. Right now, the bind param binds them the second they get bound, or it evaluates them the second they get bound. Personally, I prefer to use bind value because it allows a little extra time before we actually execute. Okay, so this right here is what I would recommend. However, each level of protection is a good thing. Okay, and right now we're only talking about binding. Now, another thing you should know is that when we do executions, I can make an array inside here and skip this entire bound function here. Let me show you this. When we execute our statement, that's the so-called kicker of the query. That's when the query gets enacted. But when we look at the execution statement here, this is on PDO execute. And for my money, this is more valuable than the textbook. But what we can do with PDO, which is a little different than the SQLi library, is actually execute arrays. So, for example, this is an array of those two values. So let's go ahead and run this and write array, and just have the first value be up full name, and the next one will be update ID. And so this is a nice way to be shorthand with it. You're basically binding the variables directly. Of course, we're not casting it as a type at this point. The execute array, I would hold off on. I wouldn't do this yet. I would do only the bind value with those sections. In fact, the execution statement right here will take numbers, which is great. It'll take an integer, which is a good sign. All right, so if you want for your homework, I can tell you right now that if you want to use either bind value or bind param or execute the variables in array, either are okay with me. I just want to start getting you the idea of after a paired statement, putting placeholders in there, and then committing them later, binding whatever they are, and then what type of data they have. And that's how you can have more secure code. Generally, SQL injections, a lot of servers will prevent them automatically, but it's still best practice to be using what the language offers. So this is a good thing. Now, one thing about SQLi, again, is it doesn't allow the array to be passed through the execution statement. So I want to do one more thing here. You may have noticed that there's another way to pass values, and that is through a colon with the variable itself. So what we're saying here is, in the execution statement, we're saying that calories will be equal to calories and color will equal color. And similarly, when we do bind param, and we look at this section, for example, we have select name, color, calories from fruit, where calories equals calories and color equals color. Well, the way this works is you're basically going to be doing, I'm going to comment out this, and I'll do it all the way below. So this would be a separate example with the variable binding without the question marks. So what we could do is do colon full name, and this could be colon ID, and then down in the bind value section, let me just get to this section here, you'll see when we bind parameters, and I can just copy this over. This 12, by the way, is the length of the color. You can actually get pretty sophisticated with what you can expect. So in this case, we're going to bind full name to the variable up full name. And in this case, this would be a param str. And this would be the ID, and I'm going to bind it to the update ID. And this, of course, would be an integer. So what's the difference between this and this? Well, I can still go ahead and change this to value so we have it more exact. But the difference is that we can call these anytime. With this section, these have to be in order. 1 has to be this guy and 2 has to be this guy. So full name, we could run bind val in separate categories. Let's say we had numerous variables up in here. We can sort the order however we choose. Okay? So that's the big difference. Now I know this can get confusing, and PHP has a lot of different ways to do things. But I do recommend that we stick to, for this specific homework, which is mostly what you guys are caring about, that you stick to the bind val example right here. And I will be putting this in the class homepage under week 13, so you can use it for your homework. But also, take a good look around. This is that CRUD script, and you'll see like this is, what are the things that we're going to need to bind? Well, this will be one of them because we're passing an ID through the URL window. That's when I go to this section here and I go delete. You notice the URL window here, it's up ID equals 1. Well, this, I'm going to go ahead and delete myself. And you see it's delete ID equals 1. Well, that's coming from the URL window, so it has to be bound because we want to protect what's happening. Okay, so that's another way to protect. But this thing right here, the select ID name from users, that's just a select statement. There's no need to do parametric binding with that. But this right here, here's user ID, and guess what? User ID will be done through the URL window. So that's got to be bound. So your assignment for this week, you'll be doing it for a table that you've already done, the contacts table, and you'll be it has more fields, so you're just going to have to keep either the question marks or the text itself and bind the values before you execute. But that's only one of the parts of security this week, so we'll get to the others in separate videos. But this is how to bind values before we execute them in an SQL prepared statement.